I was planning on taking the day off today, but I think we all know how that went. At least the episode was amazing. If Taipei keeps this up, I honestly wouldn't mind him crashing my daily plans. Though just between you and me, I feel like I won't have a ton to add this time around. The episode was very shonen style, which is cool, but episodes like that don't usually offer much in the way of deep retrospective analysis. Regardless, I'll give it my all for your enjoyment. But before we dive in, a huge thank you to the channel members who make my presence on YouTube possible. Shout out to Sans, who seems to be a fellow YouTuber, to Santino the Magikarp fan, to Agua San Luis, to the Virgil fan, to Panda, to Manolo, who I've seen being very active on the channel lately, and finally to the Hollow Knight fan. Surprisingly, the shoutouts piled up on my English channel too. I want to thank Weeaboslayer, Soundsave, Luciano, and finally Agranazo, who, just like that other user I mentioned a few days ago, subscribed to both of my channels with both of his accounts. I'd offer you a Ram short, but I think I've already covered every story she stars in. Anyway, thanks to everyone I mentioned, but now let's get down to business. Welcome to the analysis of Arc 10, Episode 18 of ReZero. The episode begins with a reference to something nobody knew had happened, but it's understandable that the occasion arose. You see, while we have a record of most of the things that happen in Subaru's day-to-day life, there are sometimes interactions between characters that could have easily taken place without Subaru ever noticing. One of these interactions was between Garfield and Cecilis. Cecilis is the strongest person in the Empire, and reading his dialogue honestly makes you lose a few brain cells, but he is still an interesting and combat-savvy character. When he talks about strength, he says something that doesn't make the slightest bit of sense. But strangely enough, now that Garfield is aiming to defeat Reinhardt, he feels like he can understand a bit of what Cecilis was trying to tell him. This reflection is interesting not only because it foreshadows the feat Garfield is about to pull off, but also because we are once again introduced to the idea of the observers, beings whose existence very few people in the world are even aware of. These are entities that watch the world and exert influence through stargazers. I don't want to get too deep into their lore since it's something that was somewhat important before, but aside from the fact that I like that Taipei is keeping them in mind, I think that if Subaru wants to dispel the doubts surrounding him, he could claim to be a stargazer. That would pretty much explain why he always has such perfect timing for everything. Later, as Otto and Reinhardt were exchanging words, something is pointed out that even catches my attention, and I'm sure it confused quite a few people. It's mentioned that while Reinhardt was talking to Otto, the knight made a move to touch the hilt of his sword. This is interesting because the author kind of leaves the door open to the possibility that Otto is worthy. Or perhaps he's just baiting us for something that gets mentioned later in the episode. After Rem tries to get new information regarding the status of Emilia and her sister, Otto and Reinhardt have another exchange. In this interaction, Otto tries to make Reinhardt see that the situation inside the castle is strange, but Reinhardt is a weapon of the government and says he has come to fulfill his duty. Otto simply tells him that it looks like they won't be able to be friends, which is a reference to the friendship they struck up at the start of this arc. Afterward, as soon as Reinhardt formally asks them to surrender, arguing that he doesn't want to hurt them or have them get hurt, this triggers an outburst from Garfield, who lunges at him. And this is where the fight begins. The combat itself took up a large part of today's episode, but while the battle sequence was intense, it can be summarized quite simply. The entire Emilia camp essentially improvised and worked together to devise a strategy to knock Reinhardt off the building in order to buy the time they needed to run. What's interesting are the thoughts running in parallel to this. First, there were Petra and Meili, who felt helpless because they couldn't help, and Otto, who was thinking about how he was tricked. He reaches the conclusion that he was deceived by someone who has a power allowing for effects similar to his own. Or perhaps this mysterious enemy has a divine protection like Mei Li's. In other words, someone who controlled the living creatures in the area rather than negotiating with them. Honestly, this sounds weird. So far, aside from Sakura, no one else has been shown to be capable of such trickery. However, a friend suggested that it might have been Reinhardt who did it using his mind-controlled divine protection. Of course, I know I've said in the past that Reinhardt had committed to never using that power again, but it's one thing not to use it on humans, and quite another to use it on animals. Regardless, if you ask me whether Reinhardt used it, I highly doubt it. That's because Reinhardt can't help but see himself as a weapon of the kingdom, and if he's a weapon of the kingdom, then he must follow the limitations imposed on him to the letter. And when the members of the Six Tongues threatened him, they were very clear that he shouldn't use that power again, which you can verify in the following excerpt.
Heinkel, Astria, woke up at midnight with a pang of unease gnawing at his gut. Sitting up in the dim light of the room, he found himself wrapped in a blanket on the floor. Although he had a bed of his own, he preferred to sleep right there, watching over the eternal slumber of his wife, Luana. Between stifled complaints and a held-back yawn, he wondered if little Reinhardt had gotten up. His son had always been an unusually reserved child, unable to lean on others, perhaps due to the absence of an awake mother, leaving Heinkel plunged into an unfamiliar fatherhood for which he felt unprepared. To make up for his shortcomings, he often relied on the staff, or his own parents, though deep down he fervently wished to turn to the latter as little as possible. As he moved down the moonlit hallway, Heinkel tilted his head upon noticing the curtains fluttering from a sudden gust. He went to close the window, puzzled because it should have remained shut, when a voice, icy and sharp as glass, ordered him from behind not to turn around. Heinkel froze, cursing himself for not having brought his sword, convinced that if he were armed, he wouldn't be in such a predicament. The voice then informed him that he was under suspicion of criminal insurrection. Heinkel stuttered in confusion at the accusation of a crime he didn't remember committing, but the presence he felt behind him prevented him from turning to explain. It wasn't just one person. He sensed a multitude surrounding both his position and the entire mansion, realizing with horror that his wife and son were now potential hostages. Desperate, he asked what he should do to dispel the suspicions or why they believed such a thing, to which the intruder responded by mentioning the divine protection of mind control. Faced with Heinkel's confusion, the interlocutor explained that it was a historic and dangerous power capable of influencing the thoughts of others and even toppling nations, and that they suspected he was the epicenter of said influence. Heinkel vehemently denied it, asserting that he possessed no protection whatsoever, but the voice reminded him of the case of his old friend Marcos Gildark, with whom he had met that very day. They informed him that Marcos, for external reasons they suspected were linked to Heinkel, had changed his mind and decided to return to the Knights. In that instant, Heinkel understood the terrifying possibility of what was happening. Without waiting for an answer, he bolted toward a specific room, momentarily leaving the intruder's surveillance behind. Bursting into his son's room, he found the boy sitting on the bed, looking at him in surprise. Heinkel flew toward him and, grabbing him by his small shoulders, urgently asked if he had made any wish for his sake, specifically after hearing him say that he would be happy if Marcos returned to the Order. Reinhardt's expression distorted with fear. Cowering and clutching his red hair, the boy apologized through sobs, admitting that he only wanted to help his father and fearfully asking if he was angry. Heinkel hesitated, although he was moved by his son's consideration. The words of the assassins weighed heavily on him. He knew he could not respond with kindness to a power capable of destabilizing a country. Firmly, he ordered Reinhardt never to use that strength again, insisting that it was not permitted to manipulate people's hearts at his whim. Heinkel embraced his son and raised his voice until it became a shout that could be heard by all the assassins hidden in the mansion, swearing that he would never allow the boy to use that power again. He pleaded with the intruders, saying that Reinhardt would behave, that he was a good boy and Luana's treasure. His shouts were a desperate plea for the child's safety and for not losing the only path back left for his wife. He clung to Reinhardt, sobbing for what felt like an eternity, until he finally felt that the numerous presences had vanished. He only returned to reality when his son's small hand touched his cheek. Reinhardt, with a tremulous voice, assured him that he wouldn't do it again and that he had erased said protection. Heinkel, though surprised and skeptical of the idea that a divine protection could simply be erased, accepted his son's claim with exhaustion and relief, urging him to live without it from then on. He accepted Reinhardt's apologies, understanding that his son, as the possessor of unparalleled power since birth, walked a different path from the rest of the world. Longing to regain his peace, Heinkel accepted his son's proposal to all sleep together in Luana's room, like a united family. As Heinkel carried the boy out of the room, Reinhardt glanced toward the window. Only his blue eyes witnessed a shadowy figure outside, moving its lips in silence, ordering him to ensure he served the kingdom for the sake of his family. An image and a command that would be etched into the boy's mind forever.
So if you ask me if Reinhardt used that divine protection to trick Otto through the animals, I'd say he didn't even do it. Another thing that caught my attention in this part is how Petra asks Mei Li not to use her power because using it could bring bad rumors to the Amelia faction's reputation. And this is something that will blow up at the end. While all this was happening, there's a bit of a description of Garfiel's combat choreography, and something really grabbed my interest. It's said that in the first exchanges between the two fighters, Reinhardt began to deflect the impact of the boy's blows to the sides, but Garfield didn't let him and started triggering explosive attacks, in a way. Honestly, I smiled a lot reading this part because it shows Garfield has learned from the fight he had against Olbart. See, back in the Empire arc, when Garfield fought Olbart, he was made a fool of because the old man redistributed all his powerful attacks into the ground. At the time, Garfield was able to compensate for that counter because Roswell arrived to help, but I'm glad to see that Garfield now has a countermeasure for opponents who use that move on him. It seems even Reinhardt didn't expect Garfield to be able to do that, and after seeing all the attacks the boy throws at him, he admits that he has improved. Later, there's a comment emphasizing that Reinhardt wasn't in the best of conditions at this moment due to everything that has happened. The knight has no desire to fight and lacks the spirit for it, unlike Garfield, who has both the reasons and the drive. I know this is the author's way of making us believe that if the group managed to escape Reinhardt, it was due to these exceptional circumstances. But I can't help but feel there's something more here. You see, in the Empire arc, when Garfield fought a dragon, it's said that he was not only on the verge of death, but also lacked the strength to deal with one of the strongest creatures in the world. And it's mentioned that during a brief feint he began to dream of his companions. He imagines them giving him encouragement, and upon returning from the dream, he finds the strength necessary to match the dragon. Unless I'm remembering wrong, it's not made clear at that moment if it was in that dream that Garfield was affected by Corleones. But I would say yes, since after waking up, he starts to turn the situation around. Now for the question that really matters. Did Garfield unconsciously use Corleones in today's fight? I'd say yes, since in the battle that took place, it's narrated how Reinhardt lands a blow that, in Garfield's own words, was even more devastating than the hit he took from the dragon. Without wanting to take anything away from the kid, I believe he only managed to withstand it because of Corleones. At least that's my hypothesis, given that prior to all this, Garfield once again starts imagining his allies cheering him on. To me, this is a sort of repetition of the moments leading up to his confrontation with the dragon that almost defeated him. Regardless, I hope this is confirmed or debunked soon. Although, being realistic and after discussing it with a friend, I think it's most likely that Corleones isn't actually active. If it were, Betty would have been able to use more mana than usual, and we already saw that didn't happen. But getting back to the topic, it was this blow received from Reinhardt that signaled the counterattack from the Amelia camp. It's said that Garfield clings to Reinhardt's right arm, immobilizing him, while Otto prepares an attack targeting his left arm. Shaula, Petra, and Mei Li set up an attack, taking advantage of the fact that the knight's arms are occupied, and if that attack failed, they had Rem ready with another one. Unfortunately, Reinhardt, being the superhuman he is, overcomes everything. Even after counterattacking Rem's weapon with brute force, the strength with which he responded to the impact was so great that Rem dislocated the shoulder she used for the attack. And just when the Amelia camp thought all was lost, Wilhelm arrived, ensuring their efforts weren't in vain. Not only did he help with that, but he also said two interesting things. First, he said that Reinhardt underestimates the lengths people will go to for their goals. And second, what I consider most important, Wilhelm himself said that he cannot entrust his sword to the current kingdom. This honestly really catches my attention. Wilhelm seems to be completely aware of the accusations against Crush and Subaru, and the fact that he supports them despite this makes me believe he may have noticed certain irregularities behind the scenes. For example, while he might not be sure if the Miklotov who died was real or not, I'm certain he would notice if Bordeaux is acting strange. Why? Because he and Bordeaux were very close during the events of the Demi-Human War. So my headcanon is that Wilhelm detected these irregularities and decided to help the rebel side of the kingdom. Something I'd love to see as soon as possible are Wilhelm's thoughts on young Subaru. I feel that one thing Arc 9 did wrong was not showing us Wilhelm's reaction to Subaru being sealed. We obviously know he was worried and all that, but his actual thoughts on the matter were never narrated. At least, not that I recall. After leaving a serious wound on Reinhardt's legs, the group decides to flee, but not before following Otto's recommendation to head to a place where he wouldn't hear voices, so they couldn't be tricked or reported by the local animals. But it's there that we see Reinhardt unsheath his sword and prepare to attack them from a distance. And this is the most striking part. Who is worthy? I think the worthy person must be between Wilhelm and Otto. Otto. Because at the start of the chapter, the author raised the question by narrating how Reinhardt touched the hilt of his sword upon seeing him in today's episode. Wilhelm is also a candidate because, besides dedicating his life to the sword, it's said in Arc 9 that his strength has been increasing astronomically, even matching or exceeding the skill he had in his youth. However, while I was writing this, a friend shared his impressions and convinced me to add Garfield. Garfield is a kid whose immense potential has always been highlighted. Even back in Arc 6, Wilhelm spoke to him about his potential in an excerpt that was unfortunately cut from the anime, though I'll make a short about it soon. If we take it as true that Garfield wasn't affected by Corleones and yet still withstood Reinhardt's blow, it means the boy's strength and will are reaching unimaginable limits, and that's why the sword considers him worthy. Sure, you'll say I'm contradicting myself because minutes ago I said the sword seemed to react to Otto, but you have to remember that Garfield was also right next to him, so the sword might have been reacting to the blonde boy and not the guy in green. And here I want to throw in a theory of mine regarding what the dragon sword Reed considers worthy. I think the sword has the same personality as its wielder, that of a bastard who only deems people worthy based on who he finds interesting, depending on the situation or his mood. By this logic, I conclude that Cecilus and Wilhelm could be worthy because of their swordsmanship, while Subaru and Teresia were worthy for different reasons. It considered Teresia worthy because the sword found it funny to give the power and skill to a woman who didn't want such a burden. And Subaru, well, he's a special case due to his connection to Flugel. Regardless, my bet as of today is on Wilhelm or Garfield being the worthy one and not Otto, though I'm telling you now that if they declare Otto worthy, I won't exactly complain either. In the end, to stop Reinhardt's attack, Mei Li decides to use the sandworms she brought to attack different points of the capital, thus forcing Reinhardt to go elsewhere to help. And I want to comment on something here. I really liked how the story makes it clear that Subaru's group has managed, for the first time, to prevent the Dragon Sword Reed from achieving its goal after being unsheathed. I think that is an admirable achievement. The other thing I wanted to say is that this decision has inevitably made Mei Li an enemy of the kingdom. This action has led several people to say that the line from the future where Subaru and Reinhardt talk about how Reinhardt finished off a girl refers to that girl being Mei Li. I spoke with a translator friend, and he told me that the context in which that line is used is a peculiar one where both Subaru and Reinhardt consider that girl an enemy, and I don't think Subaru would ever come to see Mei Li that way. So, if it's not Mei Li, who could it be? Well, even I don't know, but I'd like it to be someone somewhat important and not just some random girl from a random place. Which reminds me, in the Gluttony side story, there was a girl who was a minor character, but the author expressed a desire to include her in the main story. I'm just saying it would be a nice touch if that girl's inclusion is in that scene. How did she become an enemy of the kingdom? I don't know, but I hope we find out soon. Another thing being discussed was the possibility that, to prevent Mei Li from using the same technique in the future, Reinhardt might request her divine protection. Even though Mei Li's novel makes it clear that her divine protection is unique, that wouldn't stop Reinhardt from taking it. See, while Reinhardt can request divine protections with ease, there was actually some doubt as to whether he could request unique ones, that is, those that can only have one owner at a time. This was somewhat answered when it was revealed that Reinhardt requested the divine protection of the Sword Saint and accidentally took it from his grandmother. The downside is that this confirmation came from an author's comment on YouTube. Believe me, I'd love to show you the screenshot where the author's account commented this during a ReZero stream, but it was a long time ago. While I'm aware my source is non-existent, I'm sure if you ask any veteran of the fandom, they can confirm this. I'm aware that what the author says about the work is canon, but it's also true that he can change his mind until he actually writes it in the novel. Personally, I'd like for Reinhardt to take Mei Li's power, just to make things more exciting so the good guys don't just escape every time by repeating the same trick. But that's all for today. While I usually say goodbye here, there's something I'd like to mention. A few days ago, the Liliana novel I mentioned in other videos came out, and while it wasn't a particularly interesting novel, it did give us some touching details, like how the kids in Pristella really admire Subaru because of the speech he gave, and it's said that many of them want to be knights just like him. It makes me wonder, what will the children and adults of Pristella think now that Subaru has been accused of being a traitor to the kingdom? There are some additional interesting facts that this novel brought with it, and while I'd like to make a short about them, I'm not entirely convinced yet. Regardless, if you want to know these facts, I'll ask you to check my post on the YouTube community tab. But now, I'm truly heading out. Thanks for watching this video and for continuing to support me. Making videos and earning money from what I love is something I enjoy, and I enjoy it even more after having been in a job I didn't like at all. But that's enough lore about my life for today. See ya!